think of the rural West, what do you think of? Maybe you think of vast public lands that you escape to when life feels a little too plugged in, or the river you stick your feet in even though you know that water is still cold on the hottest summer day, or the mountains that you sneak in one more late summer hike on. Myself, I think about hope. Yet, we often see rural communities presented as something much more bleak and sad. We see headlines like this, or this one, another, and another. And these headlines, they tell one story about rural communities, but I want to tell you a different, and I think better, story. There are two things you should know about me before we really get into what is happening in rural communities. First, like some of you, I've spent much of my life living in rural towns in the West. I grew up in a small Idaho town of 1,400 people, spent my summers off the beaten path in Eastern Oregon, tried to move to the city for college, and after a year, found myself back in the comfort of a rural town when I transferred here to the University of Montana Western. And I now reside in Southeast Idaho, where I'm lucky enough to be surrounded by open space. I've always called the rural West home, and I have no plans of changing that. Second, I'm a rural sociologist, which means I spend a lot of time trying to understand rural communities. I look at the impacts of social changes, population change, and economic changes in rural communities, like what those headlines I showed earlier describe. But I know that the news headlines and the research articles don't always capture the full picture of rural places and rural people. Rural communities are more than the headlines I just showed of despair and struggles. In fact, these rural communities are resilient and caring and even hopeful. And not hopeful in the way that we hope it will rain or I hope I don't forget what to say up here, but hope as a purposeful, planned, and driven attempt to create a better future and to see oneself as an agent of that future. To illustrate this hope, I'm going to share a story from my time here in Beaverhead County. A couple of summers ago, I conducted a survey about how residents of Beaverhead County think about the future of their community, among other things. I used a survey method called drop-off pickup, in which we would knock on doors and ask folks to complete our survey, and then we returned a few days later to pick up our survey. This meant I spent a lot of time on porches talking to people. Sometimes we talked about the local restaurants or the stormy skies or the dogs milling at my feet. But at some point in the conversation, folks often ended up saying something about how much they loved where they lived. I remember standing on a porch on a late afternoon, and the man I was talking to gestures across the valley and tells me how lucky we all are to live here. And those sort of moments kept happening. And more broadly, folks also talked about how much they wanted to stay, hope their kids would stay, or hope their kids came back to live here. And all of these interactions illustrated a really deep love for the place that they called home. As someone who also loves Beaverhead County and rural places across the West, I should not have been surprised by this response, but I was. I was surprised by how often people reported their love for their community and spoke of feeling hopeful for the future of their community. One evening, towards the end of my survey pickup, when I was exhausted, over-caffeinated, and wondering why I thought it was even a good idea to do what I was doing, I stopped at a house, planning to grab a survey off the porch and quickly head to the next house so I could finally get home to my house. I left my car running, threw my car door open, and headed up to the porch. Sadly, there was not a survey waiting for me on the porch. I knocked, and a frail voice invited me in. I paused, and then walked in, hoping that I wasn't about to be a headline in the local newspaper. An older woman greeted me, and I promptly launched into my speech about survey pickup. She stopped me, thanked me, a shocking occurrence for a survey researcher, and told me she had spent her whole life living in Beaverhead County and had wanted someone to ask these kind of questions. I felt my professional demeanor slip as I held back tears. I told her I loved this place too, and I wanted to understand what made it so special. As I continued my survey and my time living in Beaverhead County, I kept coming back to that conversation and the way people talked about their community with such strong and positive language. I wasn't standing on porches talking about this headline or that headline. I was mostly talking about what people loved about the place they lived, how lucky they felt to live there, the great things in the community, and the future they saw for the community. I found that rural communities are hopeful and resilient. And research on hope suggests that there is both individual hope and collective hope. Individual hope being how we as individuals can take action to create the future we want to see and that we feel as though we can create that change. Collective hope is a belief that we are part of something bigger, a group of people that are working together towards a shared vision of the future. Unsurprisingly, individual hope drives collective hope, and collective hope drives individual hope. You can't have one without the other. And we can see this individual and collective hope at play here in Dillon. J.C. Park shows us what hope can create. Located in the center of town, J.C. Park has a playground, a splash pad, and picnic tables. On a warm day, you are likely to see families having picnics, kids playing, or community events like music in the park or the Kids Stick Horse Rodeo. And what is notable about J.C. Park is that members of the community came together to create a space that reflected what they want to see in Beaverhead County. The park is maintained by volunteer days, and the park itself exists because of local donations, including things like rounding up your change at the local grocery store and volunteer labor. And I'm not talking about J.C. Park just because I love a good park. I'm talking about J.C. Park because it really illustrates the power of collective hope in rural places and points to how the stories we tell about rural places are kind of incomplete. Residents aren't standing by and letting communities fail or fall or wallowing in despair. They're resilient and they're working together to keep the community the place they love. How we talk about people and places matter. When we talk about rural places as what is going wrong in the way that the headlines tend to, we aren't recognizing the hope that exists in these communities. We aren't capturing the individual hope held by those who walk outside every morning and feel lucky to live where they do, or how that contributes to the collective hope created by volunteer days at J.C. Park. And I want to be really clear. I'm not dismissing the importance of understanding the struggles and conflicts in rural communities. Of course, rural places and people are faced with struggles, whether it's the loss of land, increasing housing prices, or any of the headlines we saw earlier. But the response to those struggles is telling, and we see residents remaining hopeful in the face of these challenges. And the story needs told. So I ask, what would headlines look like if we looked for hope in rural places? Could they look like this? Over 90% of residents of rural southwest Montana agree or strongly agree that they want to remain in Beaverhead County. Or maybe they could look like this. I love where I live and I don't want to live anywhere else. To tell a more complete story about rural places, we, whether as residents, researchers, or just people who love rural places, can engage with that hope, in part to better understand how new challenges can spur positive social action. For example, we can support projects like J.C. Park, youth programs like 4-H, or community gardens. And on a larger scale, we can better understand why we should have hope for the future of rural America. I found hope on the porches of Beaverhead County, and I think if we look for hope, we will find it. So, think about where you can find hope. You might find hope in your local park, at the grocery store, or around the dinner table, or probably in this room. So I ask, look for hope, and wherever you may find hope, nourish it and share it. With this hope, we can tell a better story about rural America. Thank you.